Gravel sprayed into the air as the heavy steel gate of my ranch bent backward with a sickening screech, the lock snapping in half and flying into the dirt like a bullet, and before I could even blink Karen's shiny SUV came barreling through the opening like she was storming Normandy Beach, her horn blaring, her window rolled down, and her shrill voice carrying across the open fields as she screamed that she had every right to drive through my property because the HOA declared the road public access. I was still standing there holding a bucket of feed for my horses, watching dust roll over the corral as startled animals bolted, when the ridiculous sight of 3 more HOA vehicles lined up behind her made it crystal clear that this wasn't a random intrusion but a full-blown parade of entitlement, complete with Karen waving her arm out the window like she was a queen on tour. One of her passengers, some poor guest who clearly didn't know what was going on, leaned out of the window and yelled if this was where the barbecue was supposed to be, and the absurdity of it all almost made me laugh until I realized my fence was snapped in half. My animals were spooked, and once again Karen had shattered every line of decency that separated my land from their fantasies. I shouted across the dirt road that she was trespassing for the last time and that she had 5 seconds to turn around before I called the sheriff, but she slammed on her brakes, raised her sunglasses, and screamed that I was the one committing a crime for locking a community road, then demanded I personally escort her and her guests to the lake on my property because, in her words, nature belonged to everyone. The ridiculousness of her argument was only matched by the sheer confidence with which she delivered it, and by then the second SUV had pushed through the half-broken gate, rattling the hinges even more, leaving splinters and shards of metal hanging like teeth from a predator's jaw. My blood boiled, and for a moment all I could think about was how many times this woman had harassed me with fake fines, called the sheriff on me for owning cattle too close to her view, and even tried to claim that the sound of my rooster crowing at dawn was a violation of community peace regulations, even though my ranch sat miles outside the HOA's legal borders. She stepped out of her SUV now, planting her heels in the dust like she was about to deliver some grand declaration, waving a clipboard around as though paperwork made her royalty, and with every word she shouted she attracted more and more of her followers, who had apparently been waiting behind the main road ready to join this ridiculous march. Soon I was staring down a caravan of cars and confused faces, some filming the confrontation with their phones, some laughing, some already complaining about the lack of shade, and all I could do was stand in disbelief that Karen had once again managed to turn my quiet afternoon into a circus. What made it worse was that she wasn't just here to scream this time, she was here to host something, because in the back of her SUV I could see coolers, folding chairs, and even a few bags of party decorations, and when one of her friends asked if they should set up the tent near the corral or by the lake, I nearly dropped the feed bucket. I told them flatly that if one chair touched my land I'd have them all charged with trespassing, but Karen laughed so loud that even the horses froze mid-stride. Then she said in her piercing voice that I'd never win because she had the whole community behind her and the law would always side with families over a lone rancher. Her arrogance wasn't new, but something about the way her guests cheered, clapped, and honked their horns as if she had delivered some great victory speech was the exact moment I realized words and warnings would never be enough, because Karen didn't understand boundaries, she only understood spectacle. The sheriff wasn't here yet, though I had a hunch he'd be called before long, and while the HOA might have thought they were staging some righteous reclamation of public land, all I saw was a horde of entitled people storming through a gate they didn't own, threatening to trample not just my fields but my sanity. My neighbors had warned me over coffee just a week earlier that Karen was planning something outrageous, that she had whispered to the HOA board about teaching me a lesson, and that she'd been passing out flyers for some grand event near the ranch by the lake, which of course was mine. I had laughed it off then, but watching the scene unfold now with SUVs grinding over my gravel road and Karen pointing like a general toward where she wanted her guests to gather, I knew the time for laughing had ended. This wasn't just trespassing, it was war, and if she wanted to turn my ranch into her playground, then I would give her a spectacle she'd never forget. For the moment, though, I let her scream and posture, her voice echoing like nails against steel, and I simply stared, memorizing every detail: the ridiculous hat perched on her head, the clipboard clutched like a weapon, the smug grin plastered on her face as if victory was already hers. Inside my chest, anger boiled over into resolve, because while she believed she was invincible with her herd of 200 guests behind her, she had no idea that she had finally pushed me beyond tolerance, that I had started planning, scheming, and imagining the one move that would not only stop her but humiliate her so deeply that she would never dare cross me again. The image of my broken gate, twisted metal still dangling in the breeze, seared itself into my brain as a symbol of how far this madness had gone, and as Karen climbed back into her SUV and signaled her guests to follow her deeper onto my property, I knew one thing for certain. If she thought she had trapped me with her arrogance, she was about to learn what a real trap looked like. By the time Karen's caravan disappeared down the dusty trail that wound toward the lake, I was standing alone at the gate with my jaw tight and my patience gone, staring at the wreckage of steel and wood and knowing that if I did not act now, I would be living like a prisoner on my own land forever. The problem with Karen was that she had never been stopped in her tracks, never been forced to face a consequence so absolute that she could not talk her way around it with her screeching voice and bogus HOA rules. The sheriff laughed at her but rarely did anything beyond issuing warnings, the courts groaned under her frivolous complaints, and the neighbors all shrugged in resignation, as though she were a hurricane that had to be endured instead of challenged. But I was not going to endure anymore, and as the dust settled I remembered something my grandfather once said when he first handed me the keys to this ranch. If you want to deal with wild animals, you do not argue with them, you build the right kind of trap. That phrase had sat dormant in my mind for years, and now it resurfaced with clarity sharper than the broken gatepost at my feet. I looked at the deep stretch of road just beyond the entrance, a natural dip in the earth that had always collected water after heavy rain, and a wild thought struck me so hard I nearly laughed out loud. If Karen wanted to treat my land like her personal roadway, then I would turn that very road into a snare so humiliating, so unforgettable, that the legend of it would spread faster than her Facebook rants. The plan grew in my head like wildfire as I paced the gravel. I would dig, and not just a shallow ditch or a mound of dirt to slow her tires, but a hidden pit, wide and deep enough to swallow her arrogance whole. The soil there was loose, easy to work with, and I still had the old backhoe that had been gathering dust in the shed since the last irrigation project. I imagined covering the pit with a thin layer of wooden planks and dirt, sturdy enough to look like solid ground but fragile enough to collapse under the weight of a car. I pictured the first crunch of wood snapping, the sudden gasp of air as her SUV dropped, and the stunned faces of her guests as they found themselves not in the middle of a victory parade but trapped like cattle at the bottom of a giant hole. The thought electrified me, a mixture of justice and comedy, because Karen thrived on spectacle, and I would give her one bigger than anything she had ever orchestrated. That afternoon I hauled the backhoe out of the shed, its engine coughing to life after months of silence, and rolled it down to the spot. The ground shook with every bite of its metal teeth, dirt flying into heaps on either side, and with each pass I felt my anger loosen, replaced by a dark satisfaction that hummed in my veins. Hours passed, the sun dipped low, and still I dug, sweat soaking my shirt, muscles aching, but determination driving me forward. By the time night fell, I had carved out a pit the size of a swimming pool, and standing on its edge I could already imagine headlights sweeping across the horizon, Karen's smug grin faltering as the earth gave way beneath her. I dragged planks from the barn, laid them carefully across the opening, and covered them with dirt and gravel until the trap looked like nothing more than an untouched piece of road. It was flawless, invisible, the kind of trick that would never cross Karen's mind because she was too convinced of her own power to suspect that someone else might be 2 steps ahead of her. When I finally sat back on the tailgate of my truck to catch my breath, the moon casting silver light over the hidden pit, I realized the plan was not just about Karen anymore. It was about reclaiming control of my land, about showing the entire HOA that their imaginary rules had no authority here, that my ranch was not their playground or their shortcut or their social club. For too long I had let their arrogance nibble at the edges of my peace, but tomorrow, when Karen rolled in again with her horde of guests, that peace would be restored with the sound of crashing wood and panicked screams. A part of me wondered if it was too cruel, if trapping 200 people in a pit might be a step too far, but then I remembered the smashed gate, the terrified horses, the endless harassment, and I decided cruelty was the wrong word. It was justice, poetic and sharp, the kind that would leave no room for excuses. The next morning I tested the cover by walking across it myself, careful steps over the planks, feeling them wobble just slightly beneath the dirt, enough to convince me the balance was perfect. A person could pass unharmed, but a vehicle laden with passengers would send the whole thing tumbling down. I spread a thin layer of gravel to blend it into the road, and then raked the edges smooth until the trap looked as natural as the land around it. My stomach twisted with a strange mix of excitement and nerves, because traps are one thing in theory, another in practice, and while I could envision the outcome with almost comic clarity, I also knew the moment of truth would bring chaos. Still, I welcomed it, because chaos was the only language Karen seemed to understand, and for once, it would not be her wielding it against me, but me against her. By midday I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring down the road, waiting. The silence of the ranch stretched heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the corral, but underneath that silence I could feel the storm coming. Karen was never one to leave things unfinished, and after yesterday's parade, she would return with reinforcements, convinced that she had claimed my land. I almost pitied the friends she would drag along for the spectacle, the ones who thought they were headed for a party by the lake, blissfully unaware they were about to become part of the most legendary trap in HOA history. But pity gave way to anticipation as I imagined the look on her face, the screech of her voice cracking with shock instead of arrogance, and the way the entire crowd would finally see her for what she was, not a leader, not a queen, but a fool who had mistaken someone else's land for her stage. And with that thought, I leaned back, the hidden pit waiting in silence just beyond the gate, and I smiled for the first time in weeks. The next afternoon the quiet of the ranch cracked apart with the sound of engines rumbling down the distant road, a rolling thunder of SUVs, trucks, and minivans that announced the return of Karen's parade long before I could see the dust rising on the horizon, and as I set down my coffee cup on the porch railing I felt the mix of nerves and anticipation spark to life in my chest, because this was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment where the line between arrogance and consequence would finally snap. The sound grew louder until it echoed off the hills, and then I saw them, a caravan of cars snaking down the gravel, headlights flashing in the afternoon sun, banners poking out of windows, people leaning out with cameras ready as if this was some grand procession instead of a mass trespassing. Karen led the charge, of course, her SUV gleaming, her arms stretched proudly out of the window, pointing forward like a general commanding her troops, her voice barely muffled even over the roar of engines as she shouted for everyone to follow her to the lake, because apparently she had promised them the event of the year. My horses skittered nervously in the corral, dust billowing into their pen as the first line of cars approached the gate, the broken steel still dangling like a wounded sentinel, and I leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, hiding the small grin that tugged at the corners of my mouth. They had no idea what was waiting just beyond that gate, and for once I was grateful for Karen's inability to see past her own nose, because her arrogance had blinded her so completely that suspicion never even entered the picture. The first SUV rolled past the threshold, its tires crunching over the gravel, and I held my breath as it reached the exact spot where the hidden pit waited beneath its thin disguise. For a split second everything looked normal, wheels turning, gravel spitting, and then came the groan of wood snapping like brittle bones, followed by the sudden whoosh of collapsing dirt as the ground gave way beneath the vehicle. The SUV dropped nose first, tilting sharply downward as its back tires kicked up into the air before the entire weight pulled it down into the pit with a thunderous crash. Shouts erupted from the passengers inside, high-pitched screams mixing with the metallic screech of the car's frame against broken planks, and dust shot up in a massive cloud that rolled out over the road. Karen's car, right behind, slammed on its brakes too late, the screech of tires useless as the front bumper lunged forward, and the entire SUV slid nose first into the pit, colliding with the trapped vehicle inside in a cacophony of metal, glass, and panicked voices. For a moment the road looked like the mouth of some giant beast that had decided to swallow cars whole, and then the rest of the caravan piled up behind, horns blaring, drivers shouting, but momentum carried them forward until one by one, more vehicles slid, rolled, or crashed into the pit. People tried to scramble out of open doors, only to tumble into the dirt as others clung desperately to the edges, but the sheer chaos of it all was almost too much to take in at once. It was slapstick and disaster rolled into one, the kind of scene that would have been impossible to script, and from where I stood it was like watching years of frustration finally transform into the most outrageous comedy routine I had ever witnessed. Karen's voice cut through the madness like a banshee, shrieking that she would sue me for attempted murder, that I had endangered innocent families, that I had violated federal law, and yet the image of her clinging to her car door, one shoe lost in the dirt, her sunglasses hanging crooked from her face, made her threats ring hollow, almost comical. Guests scrambled in every direction, some filming the chaos with their phones as if it were entertainment, others shouting at Karen for leading them into this mess, demanding to know why they were in a hole instead of at a lake party. A few tried to climb out by stacking coolers and chairs, slipping and sliding as dirt crumbled beneath their hands, while others gave up and sat miserably in their cars, honking uselessly as though that might somehow change their situation. From the porch I watched it unfold with a strange calm, knowing this was not just revenge but revelation, because here was Karen stripped of her power, her crowd finally seeing the consequence of her arrogance in real time. She shouted for order, tried to rally them with promises of compensation, even waved her clipboard like a flag of authority, but the voices around her shifted from supportive to hostile, a chorus of complaints and accusations that turned her rally into a mutiny. The guests who had once cheered her were now demanding she pay for their damages, calling her reckless, asking what kind of lunatic convinced 200 people to drive onto someone else's property without permission. The pit itself looked like some kind of surreal stadium, cars stacked haphazardly, guests clambering over hoods, dust swirling around like smoke after a battle, and in the middle of it all was Karen, red-faced and frantic, her hair tangled, her words drowned out by the chaos. I almost felt sorry for her until she locked eyes with me, standing tall on my porch, and pointed with a trembling finger as though she had caught me in some unspeakable crime. She screamed that I had set a death trap, that I would spend the rest of my life in prison, that I would regret the day I crossed her, and though her words were sharp, her voice cracked with panic, the sound of someone who realized control had slipped completely out of her hands. The irony of her threats only deepened the humor of it all, because no matter what she said, the visual truth of the pit shouted louder, and everyone there could see with their own eyes who was truly at fault. By now the sound of sirens wailed faintly in the distance, the sheriff no doubt already on his way thanks to the flood of frantic 911 calls that were surely pouring in, and the thought of him arriving to see this circus almost made me laugh out loud. I imagined his expression as he pulled up, the way his hand would slap his knee when he realized Karen had literally driven 200 guests into a hole, and I knew that whatever lecture he gave me about safety or escalation, he would not be able to hide his amusement. The spectacle was undeniable, and though part of me knew I was in for questions, maybe even trouble, the larger part of me sat back in satisfaction, because the trap had worked exactly as planned. Karen had wanted to humiliate me, to turn my land into her stage, and instead she had become the unwilling star of her own downfall, trapped not just in a pit of dirt and cars but in the eyes of her followers, who would never see her the same way again. And as the dust settled over the chaos and the sound of distant sirens grew closer, I leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, and let the satisfaction wash over me, knowing this was only the beginning of a spectacle that would echo through the town for years. The wail of sirens grew louder until they cut through the chaos like a knife, and heads spun toward the gate as the sheriff's cruiser barreled down the road with lights flashing, dust trailing behind it in a ribbon that shimmered in the late afternoon sun. The trapped guests erupted into fresh cries, waving their arms and screaming for rescue, while Karen clung to the side of her SUV, her voice shrill and commanding as she screeched for everyone to stay calm, though her own hysteria made her sound more like a ringleader losing control of a circus than any sort of authority figure. When the sheriff slammed his door shut and stepped out, the entire scene seemed to freeze for a moment, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel louder than the bickering, as though everyone was waiting for him to declare who was guilty and who was free. I stood with my arms crossed on the porch, watching his wide eyes take in the sight of a dozen vehicles stacked like toys in a collapsed hole, people dangling from doors, others crawling out of windows, and Karen waving her arms like a conductor who had lost the orchestra. For a second his lips twitched as though he might laugh, but he pressed them together into a stern line and adjusted his hat, the weight of his badge forcing him into the performance of authority even when the absurdity of the situation was impossible to ignore. Karen wasted no time launching into her tirade, pointing at me with a shaking finger and screaming that I had constructed a death trap on my property, that I had attempted mass murder, and that she demanded my immediate arrest. Her words came in a flood, tumbling over one another so quickly she barely breathed, each accusation more dramatic than the last, and with every sentence she tried to summon back the loyalty of her guests, who were now groaning and climbing over one another to get out of the pit. The sheriff listened with his arms folded, his eyes narrowing as he let her rant, and when she finally stopped to catch her breath, he raised one eyebrow and asked flatly why in the world she had 200 people driving through someone else's ranch without permission. That single question hit like a stone, silencing the mob of guests for a heartbeat as their eyes darted toward her, because no matter how much she screamed about traps and crimes, there was no way to dodge the plain truth of what they had been doing on my land. Karen sputtered, searching for words, insisting the road was public, insisting that the HOA had declared it part of the community, insisting that she was defending the rights of the people. But the sheriff knew the landlines as well as I did, and he cut her off by saying the HOA had no authority outside its borders, and that she was lucky the rancher had not pressed charges earlier for the repeated trespassing. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some muttering that they had thought this was all approved, others shaking their heads at Karen for dragging them into the mess. The sheriff walked to the edge of the pit, peering down at the cars piled like a scrap yard and the dust-covered people trapped inside, and he shook his head slowly as though wondering what in the world possessed so many people to follow a woman this far into madness. He ordered a deputy to call for tow trucks and emergency crews, and the air filled with the buzz of radios as responders began to line up at the gate. Even as the situation turned against her, Karen refused to surrender her throne of entitlement. She shouted that the sheriff was corrupt, that he was in league with me, that justice would only come from higher authorities, and she began ranting about taking this case to federal court. Her guests looked at her like she had lost her mind, their patience unraveling as they baked in the sun, trapped in cars with broken windows and dust coating their clothes. One woman yelled that her children were terrified and that Karen would pay for dragging them into danger. A man shouted that his truck was ruined and demanded Karen cover the damages. Slowly, the mutiny I had seen beginning earlier flared into open rebellion, voices rising louder than hers, turning the mob that once supported her into a crowd pointing fingers, cursing, and demanding she take responsibility. The sheriff, half amused and half exasperated, called for calm, but he could not contain the spectacle any more than I could, because this was not just about a pit or a broken gate, this was years of Karen's arrogance crashing down in one afternoon. Cameras from local news crews began to arrive, their vans pulling up with dishes and reporters scrambling out with microphones, the gleam of opportunity flashing in their eyes as they realized they had stumbled onto a story that would dominate every headline. Helicopters circled above, their blades chopping the air, sending gusts of wind across the ranch, as if even the sky wanted a front-row seat. Reporters leaned over the pit, asking guests how it felt to be trapped, asking Karen if she regretted her decision, shoving microphones in her face as she tried to scream her way through a dozen conflicting answers. The crowd roared with laughter when she tripped over her words, when her excuses grew more absurd, when her voice cracked under the pressure of questions she could not spin. From where I stood on the porch, I caught the sheriff's eye, and for a brief second we shared an understanding that no words could capture. He knew as well as I did that this was no accident, that I had built the trap deliberately, but he also knew that explaining it would do no good, because the spectacle spoke louder than truth, and the world had already decided the villain of this story was the woman at the center of the pit. He gave me a small nod, the kind that carried a mixture of warning and humor, and then turned his attention back to the chaos, barking orders to control the crowd, to clear a path for emergency crews, to haul people out of the pit in some semblance of order. Karen screeched over his commands, threatening lawsuits, promising revenge, vowing to destroy me with every legal trick she knew, but her words bounced hollow in the hot air as her guests turned their backs and the cameras captured every second of her unraveling. By the time the first tow truck backed into position, chains rattling as they prepared to pull cars from the dirt, the spectacle had grown into something larger than anyone could have predicted. This was no longer a trespassing incident or a simple feud, this was a stage, and Karen had been cast as the fool for an audience far wider than she ever imagined. And as I leaned on the porch rail, watching the sheriff juggle media, guests, and chaos all at once, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The pit had done its job, but the story had only just begun, because once the news spread, Karen would not just be battling me, she would be battling the judgment of the entire world. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced, because the chaos at the pit did not simply fade into memory, it exploded outward like a wildfire, spreading across the county, into neighboring towns, and eventually to every corner of the internet where people craved a story of absurd entitlement brought to its knees. Within 24 hours there were clips of Karen screeching from the bottom of the pit circulating online, hashtags mocking her speeches, and even parody songs where her voice had been auto-tuned into a ridiculous chant about public access. The HOA board, who had once stood firmly behind her in all her petty crusades, now scrambled to distance themselves, issuing a statement that they had never authorized her so-called event, that she acted entirely on her own, and that the HOA did not condone trespassing on private property. But Karen, true to her nature, doubled down, insisting to anyone who would listen that she had been set up, that I had orchestrated the entire thing to destroy her reputation, that the sheriff himself had colluded with me to humiliate her, and that 200 innocent guests were victims of a landowner drunk on power. Her words might have carried weight once, but now every time she spoke it only fueled the fire of mockery, because the video evidence was undeniable, and the laughter of her former allies was louder than her excuses. While Karen ranted, her guests fumed, and soon I learned that several of them had already begun filing claims, demanding compensation not from me but from her personally. One man appeared on local television holding a picture of his truck, the front smashed and the windshield cracked, and he shouted that Karen had promised him a community celebration, not a demolition derby. Another family spoke tearfully about their children crying for hours after the pit incident, saying their trust had been betrayed by a woman who thought she could rewrite the rules of land ownership with a clipboard. Lawsuits piled on her doorstep faster than she could shuffle papers, and within a week it was announced that a class action suit representing nearly 100 of the attendees was moving forward. The irony of Karen's downfall was almost too rich to savor, because for years she had wielded lawsuits like weapons against anyone who dared defy her, from neighbors with lawn ornaments she didn't like to dog owners whose pets barked too loudly at night. She thrived on paperwork and intimidation, but now the avalanche of legal filings came for her, and her smug laughter was replaced by frantic press conferences where she waved stacks of documents in the air and claimed they proved her innocence. Her desperation made her reckless, and at one of those conferences she accused me of being a domestic terrorist, saying I had weaponized my land to trap and endanger law-abiding citizens, and that if the local authorities would not charge me, then she would take her case to federal agents. The room of reporters erupted in laughter when she shouted this, because her voice cracked and her eyes darted around like a cornered animal, and the footage went viral almost instantly, turning her into an international punchline. I watched it from my porch one evening with my neighbors, the screen of a laptop glowing in the fading sunlight as her rants were replayed again and again, each time more ridiculous, each time more damning. My neighbors clapped me on the back, saying I had finally done what no one else dared, that I had broken her stranglehold on the community, and though I laughed with them, part of me also knew the battle was not over, because people like Karen did not simply crawl away and vanish, they clawed and scratched until there was nothing left to fight for. And claw she did, because soon I learned she had filed not one but 3 separate lawsuits against me personally, accusing me of negligence, attempted murder, and emotional distress. The sheriff chuckled when he delivered the paperwork, telling me not to lose sleep because every lawyer in the county already considered her case a circus, but still the weight of it pressed on me as I read through the accusations, each one written with venom and desperation. She claimed I had engineered the trap with malicious intent, that I had lured her guests onto the land with false promises, that I had colluded with emergency crews to prolong their suffering for spectacle. It was the kind of narrative only Karen could invent, twisting reality until it bent to her story, but even in her lies there was a thread of truth, because yes, I had dug that pit, and yes, I had hoped it would catch her. The difference was that no one believed her framing anymore, and the more she tried to convince people, the more unhinged she appeared. Meanwhile, the HOA board found themselves cornered by their own members, because the lawsuits did not stop with Karen. Some of the guests argued that the board itself bore responsibility for allowing her to speak as though she had authority, that the HOA's history of siding with her in disputes had emboldened her to take things this far, and suddenly the entire structure of their little empire wobbled under the weight of anger and mistrust. Meetings turned into shouting matches. Residents who had once feared Karen now stood up and called for her removal, and whispers spread of dissolving the HOA altogether before more disasters could follow. It was poetic in its collapse, a tower of arrogance crumbling from within, and I could not help but feel a sense of vindication knowing that the trap I dug had triggered not only her personal humiliation but the unraveling of the institution she clung to for power. The court hearings that followed were nothing short of theater, with Karen storming into the room in garish suits, her voice booming as she declared herself a defender of justice, while the plaintiffs calmly presented photos, videos, and testimony that painted her as the reckless ringleader of a disaster. Judges rolled their eyes, lawyers smirked, and in one memorable moment, the bailiff had to stifle laughter when Karen insisted she had been acting under divine inspiration, as though the heavens themselves had commanded her to hold a lake party on my property. Each session ended worse for her than the last, and by the third hearing the crowd of onlookers waiting outside was larger than the group inside, reporters elbowing for space to catch her meltdowns on camera. What had begun as an HOA dispute had transformed into a spectacle of public shame, and though she fought with every ounce of her fury, the tide of ridicule was too strong to stop. From my porch I watched all of it unfold, the news vans parked on the roadside, the cameras snapping photos of Karen's every stumble, and I realized that my role was no longer active but symbolic. I had triggered the domino, and the rest fell without my push. Karen was fighting shadows, clawing at enemies real and imagined, and every day her voice grew weaker while the laughter grew louder. And though she threatened me with every breath, promising vengeance greater than the pit itself, I no longer feared her, because the truth had finally become louder than her lies, and her empire was collapsing under the weight of her own arrogance. Karen's humiliation should have ended in the courtroom, but her pride was too poisonous to let her fade quietly into the shadows, and instead she dug her heels deeper and rallied what little support she had left into one final stand, a desperate attempt to prove she was still the queen of the HOA and the self-proclaimed guardian of community order. She began appearing on online forums and live streams, her face lit by the glow of her computer screen as she ranted about conspiracies, about my supposed alliance with corrupt officials, and about her sacred duty to restore justice to the neighborhood. Though most viewers tuned in just to laugh at her, a handful of die-hard loyalists clung to her words, feeding her ego enough to push her toward the unthinkable. By the end of the month, rumors began spreading that she was organizing a march, not a protest at City Hall or a plea in the courthouse, but a full-scale invasion of my ranch, and this time she promised her followers that they would not be trapped or humiliated because she would expose me in front of everyone. I dismissed it as idle bluster at first, but when I spotted cars idling on the edge of town and saw flyers being slipped under doors that read "Take Back the Land," I realized Karen was not bluffing. She was assembling an army of outrage, and soon my quiet ranch would once again become the stage for her madness. I prepared differently this time, because the pit had been a one-time trick, a flash of brilliance that could not be repeated without losing its power. If Karen was reckless enough to return with reinforcements, I needed defenses that would not just shock her but scatter her entire crowd before they could set foot near my home. The days before her promised march were spent fortifying the land like a battlefield, stringing heavy chains across side paths, repairing the gate with reinforced steel beams, and setting up deterrents that would leave no doubt that my property was impenetrable. I released the cattle into the pastures closest to the entrance, not for aggression but for presence, because there is nothing more intimidating than a wall of horned beasts blocking a trespasser's path. I even rigged the old irrigation system to blast water at high pressure down the road, turning it into a muddy quagmire for anyone foolish enough to advance. My neighbors, once wary of getting involved, showed up with supplies and advice, eager to see Karen finally driven back for good, and together we built what felt less like a ranch defense and more like a frontier fortress ready for siege. The day came on a blindingly hot afternoon, the sun burning overhead as a convoy of vehicles snaked down the highway, horns blaring, banners waving, and Karen standing through the sunroof of her SUV like a deranged general leading troops into glory. Behind her were dozens of cars and trucks, some plastered with signs reading community rights now and others carrying coolers as if they were preparing for a picnic rather than a confrontation. The absurdity of it might have been comical if not for the sheer size of the crowd, a swarm of people emboldened by Karen's delusions, cheering and chanting as though they were storming the gates of some tyrant rather than trespassing on a private ranch. I stood at the porch, calm but alert, watching as the lead vehicles slowed before the gate, the crowd spilling out onto the dirt road in a wave of voices and dust. Karen raised a bullhorn, her voice screeching across the field, as she declared that the time of oppression was over, that the land would be reclaimed, and that my so-called empire of traps and intimidation was finished. The crowd roared behind her, fists pumping, cameras recording, and for a heartbeat it felt like the madness might actually overwhelm the sanity of reality. But then the defenses came alive, and everything shifted. As Karen's SUV inched forward, the irrigation system roared to life, jets of water blasting down with such force that the dirt road instantly transformed into a river of mud, tires spinning uselessly as vehicles slid sideways and passengers shrieked. The cattle, already restless from the noise, surged toward the gate in a wave of muscle and horns, bellowing loudly enough to drown out Karen's bullhorn, and suddenly the confident march turned into a scene of chaos as guests scrambled to avoid the wall of animals. Some slipped in the mud, others tripped over each other in panic, and the chain barriers rattled under the weight of people trying to push forward only to be flung back. Karen screamed for them to hold their ground, waving her arms frantically, but the spectacle of her followers being splattered with mud and shoved aside by cattle broke the illusion of her authority faster than any speech could. Her bullhorn sputtered and crackled as water sprayed into it, and the shrill feedback that followed sent people clapping hands over their ears, grimacing as the chaos grew louder and wilder. I did not move from my porch because there was no need. The defenses spoke for themselves, each one reminding Karen and her followers that this was not their land, not their playground, not their stage. The sheriff arrived minutes later, sirens once again cutting through the noise, but this time he did not rush to break it up with warnings. Instead, he parked at the edge of the field, leaned against his cruiser, and simply watched as Karen's grand invasion dissolved into a slapstick disaster. When the crowd saw him standing there, arms folded, no hint of sympathy in his eyes, they realized there would be no legal cover this time, no escape route crafted by excuses, only the raw truth of their trespass and their humiliation. Guests began fleeing, mud-splattered and soaked, piling back into their cars, reversing down the road in frantic retreat, leaving Karen standing alone at the gate, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes ruined, her hands shaking as she tried to cling to dignity that had already abandoned her. For the first time since this war began, I saw doubt flicker in her eyes, a crack in the mask of endless arrogance, and though she still shouted threats about court and vengeance, her voice was hoarse, her words hollow. Her crowd was gone, her board had abandoned her, and the sheriff's silence weighed heavier than any gavel. The ultimate showdown had ended not with me raising a hand, not with violence or confrontation, but with the collapse of her own illusion, shattered by mud, cattle, and the laughter of neighbors who had gathered on the roadside to watch. Karen had marched into battle with all the fire of a self-declared queen, but she left drenched, defeated, and utterly alone. And as the last cars disappeared into the distance and the ranch fell quiet once more, I knew the war was finished, because without her followers, Karen was just a voice lost in the wind, a sound that would fade no matter how loudly she screamed. The aftermath of Karen's downfall spread through the community like ripples across a still lake, and though I had expected a long stretch of cleanup and damage control, what came instead was a tidal wave of attention, gossip, and consequence that swept her into a place she could never escape from. Within days the news channels replayed her failed march as if it were breaking news every hour, showing slow-motion clips of her slipping in the mud, her bullhorn sputtering under the spray of water, her followers scattering like startled birds. Late-night hosts mocked her in monologues, comedians impersonated her rants, and online memes flourished with captions that turned her threats into joke. For years she had ruled through fear and intimidation, but now she was nothing more than entertainment, a cautionary tale about arrogance collapsing under its own weight. People laughed at her name where once they had whispered it with frustration, and even her staunchest allies on the HOA board resigned quietly, muttering that they had no interest in sinking with her ship. The once mighty organization fractured from the inside, meetings devolving into shouting matches until finally a vote was called to dissolve the board altogether, leaving Karen stripped of her throne and cast out as the very person who had destroyed the empire she tried so desperately to control. As for the legal storm she had unleashed, it only grew worse with each passing week. The lawsuits from her guests advanced quickly, bolstered by footage and testimony that painted her as reckless, negligent, and manipulative. Judges dismissed her countersuits against me with barely a glance, rolling their eyes as she attempted to paint herself as the victim of a conspiracy. The sheriff himself testified in one hearing, recounting the countless calls she had made to his office over trivial matters, and the gallery erupted in laughter when he described how she once demanded the arrest of a neighbor for planting sunflowers too close to her fence line. Every attempt she made to twist the narrative collapsed under the weight of her own history, and soon she faced fines and penalties that stacked higher than she could hope to pay. Creditors began circling, the HOA community she once lorded over turned their backs, and her house, once the symbol of her status, sat empty and dark as foreclosure notices appeared on the door. It was a fall so complete that it felt almost biblical, a queen dethroned not by force but by the consequences she had invited upon herself. Yet even in her defeat, Karen tried to cling to scraps of dignity, holding press conferences on the steps of the courthouse where no one came but a handful of reporters eager for more footage to mock. She screamed into microphones about conspiracies, about injustice, about divine missions and corrupt ranchers, but the crowds that once cheered her now laughed openly, some even bringing folding chairs and popcorn as though her rants were free theater. One particularly cruel night a group of teenagers projected footage of her screaming in the pit onto the side of a building downtown, and the crowd that gathered jeered until she stormed away in tears, her face red, her voice broken. That was when it truly hit me that the power she once wielded was gone forever, and that no amount of shouting or paperwork could rebuild it. She had become not a leader but a spectacle, not feared but pitied, and though part of me almost felt sorry for her, I reminded myself of the endless harassment, the broken gates, the terrified animals, and the years of torment she had inflicted on others. Pity was fleeting, justice was permanent, and the balance had finally been restored. For me, the ranch returned to peace in ways I had not known in years. The gates stayed closed without argument, the roads stayed quiet, and the neighbors, once weary of confrontation, began visiting with renewed warmth. They brought pies, shared laughter, and sat on my porch to relive the spectacle, each telling their favorite part of the story, whether it was the moment Karen slid into the pit or the way the cattle stampeded during her march. The sheriff stopped by more often, sometimes to share a cup of coffee, sometimes to chuckle about how Karen's name had become shorthand at the station for any ridiculous call. The weight that had pressed on me for years lifted slowly, replaced by a sense of freedom I had almost forgotten existed. For the first time in a long while, I could sit under the wide sky and hear only the wind in the grass and the calls of the birds, not the screech of tires or the shrill voice of entitlement. Still, the legend of what happened did not fade, and soon strangers began driving out to the ranch just to see the infamous pit. At first I shooed them away, but then I realized there was an opportunity in the curiosity, and with a bit of fencing and a sign, I turned it into a tourist attraction. People came from miles away to stand at the edge, to take pictures, to laugh at the story of how a woman and 200 guests had been swallowed whole by their own arrogance. Some even paid to walk guided tours where I recounted the saga from beginning to end, turning my ordeal into a tale that drew more amusement than anger. It was strange, but in the absurdity of it all, the pit became a monument, not to Karen's power but to her downfall, and it brought me a sense of satisfaction to know that her attempt to humiliate me had instead immortalized her folly in a way no one would ever forget. The final twist came months later when I heard that Karen had moved away, leaving behind the shattered remains of her reputation. Rumors swirled about her trying to start fresh in another community, but wherever she went, the internet followed, and her name carried the weight of her humiliation like a shadow she could never escape. Meanwhile, my ranch thrived, my peace restored, and the community that once bent under her thumb grew stronger without her. Sometimes at night, when the stars burned bright and the land stretched quiet, I thought about how close I had come to surrendering, how many times I had considered selling the ranch just to escape the constant war she waged, and I felt grateful that I had not given in. Because in the end, Karen had destroyed herself, and all it had taken was the patience to let her arrogance dig its own grave. So the story ended not with violence, not with bitterness, but with the strange comedy of justice served by spectacle. The woman who once declared she owned every road and rule now owned nothing but the echo of her own downfall, and I, the rancher she tried so hard to break, stood taller than ever, surrounded by the quiet strength of the land she could never claim. And as each new visitor laughed at the tale of the pit, as each neighbor nodded with relief at the peace that had returned, I knew the lesson would last longer than the memory of her voice. Karen had thought she was invincible, but in truth she had been one step away from the fall all along, and all it took was the right push for her empire of arrogance to crumble into dust.